Pinehurst, Massachusetts, was the kind of town where people prided themselves on appearances. Perfect homes with manicured lawns, polite conversation, and a shared belief that life's biggest secrets were best kept behind closed doors. The Thornton house, perched on a quiet street among oak trees, seemed no different. To anyone passing by, it was just another home where a couple in love lived out their days in harmony. But the truth was far more complicated. When Daniel Thornton was arrested for the murder of his wife, Grace Thornton, in the summer of 2015, it sent shockwaves through Pinehurst. The story of their marriage, once considered an example of modern love, unraveled in a way no one could have anticipated. Behind the facade of happiness were hidden lies, secrets about identity, about the past, and about the obsessive nature of love. Grace was not the woman Daniel thought she was, and as their marriage crumbled, so too did Daniel's grip on reality. It all began when Daniel discovered the secret Grace had been hiding, a secret that would push him over the edge and end in her tragic death. Grace Thornton was the embodiment of elegance and composure, a woman who seemed to have mastered the art of being everything to everyone. She was beautiful, confident, and always seemed to be in control no matter the circumstances. Daniel had fallen for her almost immediately. Their connection was instantaneous, a magnetic pull that drew them together at a business event 5 years earlier. But Grace wasn't always the poised woman Pinehurst admired. She had a past she kept buried deep within her soul. Born as Gregory Collins, Grace had spent much of her early life feeling like she didn't belong in her own body. Growing up in a small conservative town, Gregory had learned early on to suppress his true feelings, to mask the confusion and pain that came with being in the wrong body. The pressure to conform, to pretend to be something he wasn't, built over the years, until it became unbearable. In his early 20s, Gregory left home and began the long and painful process of transitioning into the woman he had always known himself to be. It wasn't just the physical transformation that was difficult. It was the emotional and psychological toll of leaving everything behind. When she became Grace, she left behind Gregory, her former life, and the people who once knew her. Grace had fought for years to reclaim her identity, to build a new life free from the shadows of her past. But no matter how far she ran, the past always seemed to follow her. By the time she met Daniel, Grace had crafted the perfect new life for herself. She was confident, sophisticated, and had built a successful career in marketing. Daniel had no reason to question her. She was everything he had ever wanted in a partner. They fell in love quickly, and within a year they were married. Still, Grace was haunted by the fear that her past might one day catch up with her. She kept her history, as Gregory Collins, hidden from Daniel, terrified that if he found out the truth, he would never look at her the same way again. The early days of Grace and Daniel's marriage were filled with passion and excitement. They had a whirlwind romance, the kind that felt too good to be true. Their days were spent traveling, dining out at the finest restaurants in Boston, and attending social events where they were often the center of attention. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, beautiful, successful, and madly in love. But even as their public life flourished, there were cracks in the foundation. Grace's internal struggle, the weight of her hidden identity, made her anxious. Every time Daniel brought up the idea of starting a family, she panicked. She couldn't give him children, and she feared that when the truth inevitably came out, it would destroy everything they had built. She started avoiding certain conversations, deflecting questions about her past. Daniel noticed, but he didn't press her too hard, at least not at first. He was too enamored with her, too swept up in the intensity of their relationship to fully acknowledge the signs that something wasn't quite right. Still, the physical distance between them began to grow. Grace, once so affectionate and eager for intimacy, started pulling away. She made excuses, work, stress, fatigue, but the truth was, Every touch from Daniel reminded her of the secret she was keeping. The guilt gnawed at her, and her withdrawal became more pronounced with each passing day. For Daniel, the change was palpable. At first, he tried to convince himself that it was just a phase, that every couple went through ups and downs. But as the distance between them grew, so too did his frustration. He couldn't understand why the woman who had once been so open with him was now shutting him out. Daniel began to wonder if there was something deeper going on. His thoughts drifted to darker possibilities. Was she hiding something from him? Was there another man? The questions festered in his mind, feeding his growing paranoia. Just as Daniel's suspicions were beginning to take root, Grace's past reared its ugly head in the form of Alex Marlowe, an old friend from her life as Gregory. Alex had been a part of Grace's former life, a partner in a financial scheme that had gone horribly wrong. They had lost contact after Grace transitioned, but Alex had never forgotten Gregory or the mistakes they had made together. Desperate for money and bitter about his own failures, Alex tracked down Grace. He knew everything about her past, and he knew that she would do anything to keep it hidden. The first time he reached out to her, it was through a simple, cryptic email. "We need to talk." Grace felt a wave of panic wash over her. She hadn't heard from Alex in years and had hoped that part of her life was buried for good. But here he was, threatening to expose everything she had worked so hard to conceal. She had no choice but to meet him. They met at a dingy cafe on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the life of luxury Grace now enjoyed. Alex wasted no time getting to the point. He demanded $75,000 in exchange for his silence. If she didn't pay up, he would go straight to Daniel and tell him everything. Grace's mind raced. She didn't have that kind of money, and even if she did, she couldn't withdraw such a large sum without Daniel noticing. But the alternative, Daniel finding out the truth from Alex, was unthinkable. She begged Alex to reconsider, to give her more time, but he was unmoved. He had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Grace left the cafe that day with a sinking feeling in her chest. She was trapped, and no matter what she did, it felt like her world was about to come crashing down around her. While Grace scrambled to figure out how to deal with Alex's demands, Daniel's paranoia was reaching a breaking point. He had noticed Grace's strange behavior for weeks, the late-night phone calls, the secretive meetings, the evasive answers when he asked where she had been. It was all adding up to one inescapable conclusion. Grace was hiding something from him. Daniel's thoughts began to spiral. He started tracking her movements, obsessively checking her phone when she wasn't looking. He found nothing concrete, but that only made him more suspicious. He convinced himself that she was deleting messages, covering her tracks. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was eroding by the day. One afternoon, Daniel decided to follow Grace. She had told him she was meeting a friend for lunch, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right with him. He watched from a distance as she pulled into a rundown cafe on the outskirts of town. She wasn't meeting a friend. She was meeting a man. Daniel's heart raced as he saw her exchange what looked like an envelope with the stranger. His mind exploded with rage and confusion. Who was this man? What was she doing with him? Was she having an affair? The sight of Grace with another man fueled his paranoia, and the seed of betrayal took root in his mind. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. His thoughts were consumed by images of Grace with the stranger, of the lies she had been telling him. He felt like a fool, like everything they had built together was a sham. The woman he had loved so deeply was hiding something from him, and he couldn't rest until he found out what it was. Over the next few days, Daniel became more erratic. He watched Grace's every move, dissected every word she said, looking for clues to confirm his suspicions. He grew distant, cold, and Grace noticed the change in him. But she was too consumed by her own fears to confront him. She had no idea that Daniel was unraveling, that his mind was racing toward the point of no return. The tension in the Thornton household was unbearable. Grace knew she couldn't keep the secret from Daniel much longer. Alex's demands were growing more aggressive, and she didn't have the money to pay him off. She had no choice but to tell Daniel the truth, to hope that their love could survive the revelation of her past. One night, as they sat in the living room in tense silence, Daniel finally confronted her. His voice shook with anger as he demanded to know what was going on. "Who is he?" he asked, his eyes burning with jealousy. Grace's heart sank. She knew this was the moment she had been dreading. With trembling hands, Grace confessed everything. She told Daniel about her past as Gregory Collins, about her transition, about Alex's blackmail. She tried to explain that she had kept it from him because she was terrified of losing him, that she loved him more than anything and didn't want her past to destroy their future. But Daniel didn't hear her words. All he heard was the betrayal. The woman he had married wasn't the person he thought she was. His mind raced with images of deception, of lies, of a life built on falsehoods. The anger that had been simmering inside him for weeks erupted in a violent wave. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Daniel lunged at Grace. His hands closed around her throat, the force of his anger driving him to a point of no return. Grace struggled beneath him, her eyes wide with fear, but Daniel's grip only tightened. The room seemed to close in on them, the air thick with tension and the smell of sweat and fear. Grace's gasps for breath filled the space, but Daniel's mind was clouded with a red haze of fury and betrayal. All he could think about was the lies, the deception, the humiliation. The woman he had loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who had kept the truth from him. When Grace finally went still, Daniel's anger evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow realization of what he had done. He stared down at her lifeless body, his hands still around her neck, his heart pounding in his chest. The love they had shared, the life they had built, was gone in an instant. The room was silent except for the sound of Daniel's ragged breathing. His mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. He had killed her. The woman he had loved more than anything in the world was dead, and it was his hands that had taken her life. In the hours that followed Grace's death, Daniel was a man lost in his own mind. He couldn't believe what he had done, but the evidence was right in front of him. Grace's lifeless body, the bruises on her neck, the look of terror frozen on her face. Panic set in as Daniel tried to figure out what to do next. He thought about running, about leaving Pinehurst and starting over somewhere far away. But the reality of his situation was too overwhelming. There was no escaping what he had done. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't take back the moment of rage that had destroyed everything. In a daze, Daniel called the police and confessed to the murder. His voice was hollow, devoid of emotion as he told the operator what had happened. When the police arrived, Daniel was sitting on the floor next to Grace's body, his hands still shaking, his eyes glazed over with shock. He was arrested without incident, too numb to resist, too consumed by the weight of his actions to care about what came next. Daniel's trial was a media sensation. The story of a successful, well-respected man killing his wife in a fit of rage was shocking enough, but when the details of Grace's past as Gregory Collins were revealed, the case took on a new level of complexity. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers, all eager to hear the sordid details of the case. The prosecution painted Daniel as a man consumed by jealousy and paranoia, whose inability to accept the truth about his wife's past had driven him to murder. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Daniel had acted in a moment of passion, unable to cope with the revelation of Grace's secret life. The public was divided. Some saw Daniel as a victim of deception, a man who had been pushed to the edge by a lifetime of lies. Others viewed him as a monster, a man who couldn't handle the truth and had taken his wife's life in a violent act of rage. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as both sides presented their arguments. Grace's family and friends were devastated by the revelations. They had known her as a loving, compassionate woman, someone who had overcome great challenges to live her life authentically. The fact that her past had been used against her in such a tragic way only deepened their grief. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict. Daniel Thornton was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. The judge acknowledged the complex emotions that had led to the crime, but condemned Daniel's inability to control his rage and his ultimate decision to take Grace's life. The trial left Pinehurst reeling. The town that had once prided itself on its quiet, respectable image was now the center of a national conversation about identity, deception, and the dangers of living in secrecy. Grace's story became a rallying cry for the LGBTQ+ community, a tragic reminder of the risks faced by those who live with the fear of being exposed. As Daniel sat in his prison cell, the reality of what he had done began to sink in. He had loved Grace, but his inability to accept the truth about her past had destroyed everything. The woman he had cherished was gone, and it was his hands that had taken her life. In the end, Daniel was left to confront the demons that had driven him to murder, the jealousy, the paranoia, the fear of betrayal. But no matter how many years passed, the weight of his actions would remain with him, a constant reminder of the life he had destroyed in a single, tragic moment.